All right, all right. Good evening, Facebook world. Facebook world. What's going on? What is today? Today is Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. Happy Wednesday. I hope that your day has been fulfilling and that you've been living on purpose and that your steps are being guided by the Most High God. So welcome to the Plant-Based Day Pledge platform. It's your main man, Shabaka Amin, nutrition performance coach, plant-based fitness pioneer, creator of the Plant-Based Loser Challenge, and in more recent times, the Plant-Based Day Pledge. Welcome to this platform. This platform is actually in honor of this great man behind me, the late, great Chadwick Boseman. And before I go into inviting my guest on, who is a medical doctor specializing as a gastroenterologist as well as chef, I want to share with the audience, for those who may not have seen it, Marvel did this really wonderful tribute to the late, great Chadwick Boseman. And I want to show it because many of you may not be aware of it. And it's about 4 minutes and 44 seconds in duration. Watch it, enjoy it. And then we're going to deep dive. I'll bring my guest on after introducing him. And of course, everybody knows and is fully aware of the fact that Chadwick Boseman, we know him as the Black Panther or King T'Challa, passed away last week, and at the age of 43 from colon cancer. So before we go into tonight's discussion, which is centered around how African Americans can go about preventing colon cancer, go about preventing death from colorectal cancer as well, and discuss the potential of a plant-based diet and its role in the prevention, real prevention of this particular form of cancer that is affecting so many African Americans. But let me show you this really amazing tribute, and I'll start that now, and then we'll dive into our discussion for the evening.
It was Chadwick Boseman's performance in 42 that really made us take a second look. There is such an honor and dignity to the way that he played Jackie Robinson that we knew we needed for the character of T'Challa, the Prince of Wakanda.
Chadwick is an amazing actor who we thought would fit perfectly with the MCU.
Black Panther himself, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chadwick Boseman.
Chadwick, he has a lot of depth. It was amazing as an audience member to look into his eyes and see what's going on.
We must find a way to look after one another as if we were one single tribe.
A lot of the things about the character are also true about Chad. He's very knowledgeable. He's an athlete, martial artist. He's had a lot of experience playing roles that come with a lot of weight. So I think he has a person, he has a guy, has a lot of weight to him. I think he brings all of that stuff to the role. But not to mention that he's incredibly gifted as an actor and as a performer, and also as a storyteller in his own right.
I am not king of all people. I am king of Wakanda. And it is my responsibility to make sure our people are safe.
Because he is so prepared as an actor, and because his character is sort of flawless on set, it forced the other actors who had scenes with him to kind of raise their game and go, okay, this guy's not taking anything for granted. He's really leaving it all out there. So we have to keep up with him.
What doesn't Chadwick bring to the character? I mean, he's regal and grounded, and he brings a gravitas to it. So all of this feeds his T'Challa, and I think he wore the crown with dignity.
He Bombay! He Bombay!
I've known him since I was about like 17, so I've known him for a really long time. Back in New York, he did the work, obviously. You know, I just think he did an incredible job being true to the character.
Wakanda forever! I had a great time with Chadwick. Just warmth and camaraderie came into it, of course, with a great deal of respect for his previous work. So when I looked at him with proud eyes, you know, they were as mother and also as comrade and colleague and Angela. It is your time to be king.
Chadwick is just a powerhouse. He really is so talented. Every single movie he's made.
There's kind of this internal, almost nobility.
The Black Panther has been the protector of Wakanda for generations.
He's such a soulful actor and so professional, so present. He really gives so much to the other person, and he's awesome. And his presence on set, I think, makes it kind of raises the stakes a little bit for everybody.
Chadwick he's a really smart, interesting, dynamic guy, and I think he was not overwhelmed, but very surprised and somewhat taken aback by the amount of love. It ceased to become just about how well he inhabited the role and all that stuff. It's become part of our culture just as a symbol.
This welcome is one of the most amazing things I've ever experienced.
It's fun to watch just what it means to people. At times, in my head, I'll be like, well, what does this do for the world? Like, actually, what is it? You know, is it actually valuable in this climate? And I have to say, yes, it actually is. Not because it makes people escape. I think when done right, it gives people hope. I found that it means a lot.
All right, folks. Wow, what a tribute to Chadwick Boseman by Marvel. What a special tribute. What I'm going to do is introduce my guest.
You have 47 minutes.
Pardon
Stay
me
in
for a second.
communication with me.
It will help if I turn that off. What I'm going to do is introduce my guest, and we're going to start this conversation in honor of the late, great Chadwick Boseman. My guest is Dr. Ed McDonald. He's an MD, medical doctor. He is a gastroenterologist, but he is also a chef. And I'll go ahead and bring him on now. Dr. McDonald, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it. And then thanks for that wonderful introduction for Brother Chadwick. So he will be missed and definitely needs to be celebrated.
Absolutely. I agree 1,000,000,000%. As I had seen this tribute by Marvel, very well done, like a synopsis, at least with his Marvel experiences. I thought it was wonderful. It evoked emotion again, you know, because it makes you think, and I want to get your thoughts on this. You know, when you look at an individual, a human being like Chadwick Boseman, and you think of the contribution, you know, what he stood for on screen, off screen, the iconic roles, it's like there's a mystery to life. There's a mystery to death. And you say, well, why him?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once upon a time, I used to be really deep into religious studies. And there's this religious term that comes up called, I believe it's called theodicy. And theodicy is the concept of, why does bad things happen to good people? And it's one of the mysteries that I will never understand. Like these are the situations where we just have to realize that if there is a plan that God has, it may be more complicated than our own understanding. It may be beyond us. And so we try to make sense of things that maybe our minds are just not capable of making sense out of.
Exactly.
So I don't have any answers, but I think, if we try to turn this tragedy into something positive, I think conversations like this, really are examples of that. So how do we have a conversation about colon cancer? Because unfortunately, Brother Chadwick, as much as I love him, he is not the first young brother I've seen pass from colon cancer. And hopefully he will be the last, but I fear that will not be the case. So to decrease more brothers and sisters, and not only brothers and sisters, but anybody from passing on early from colon cancer, we really should have a conversation about, what is colon cancer? How can we prevent it? Is it preventable? What type of lifestyle should we live to decrease our risk of colon cancer? So, for me, I've been trying to go on some of these podcasts, even though I feel like I'm in mourning. I mean, it's sad. Like I literally shed a tear. I saw one of those videos where I think it was a Gold Cast video that had him talking about his love of Denzel Washington and how Denzel Washington paid for his college. And I mean, it was a lot to take in. And, for me, and for a lot of African Americans, I mean, the movie Black Panther and all the hype surrounding it, I mean, it was probably one of the biggest cultural events over the past 15 years outside of Barack Obama's election. I mean, like, I've never seen, like, older sisters, dress up in dashikis outside of church and hop on a church bus to go to the movie theater. Like I've never seen that happen.
The folks you would never think would put on a dashiki.
Right. Exactly. I mean, the only thing close that I maybe recall seeing some years ago was when Malcolm X came out. But, to my recollection, I can't think of any movie that has been generally just well accepted and received by the Black community overall, where we were just excited about it, let alone something that's science fiction. I mean, I've seen people come out to watch the movie. They didn't even know what the movie was about. Like they thought it was really about the Black Panthers. Like I remember one of the women in my churches. They were like, I thought, Bobby Seale and Edward Cleaver were going to be in there. Like, no, that's the Black Panthers, not.
It's
Black
funny you would say that. It's funny that you would mention the Black Panthers because you probably are aware of this, but initially, Marvel wanted to release the Black Panther. I don't know if it was the film as so much as the comic book, which actually started in the 60s, but because of the times and the association with the Black Panthers organization, Marvel basically tucked that project away for decades.
Yeah. Because
of the association between the Black Panthers organization and the Black Panther character by Marvel. So it's even when we think about, I agree with what you said.
Yeah.
The movie coming out was definitely not only for the African American community, the way in which it was embraced. You had the MCU world.
Yeah.
It was embraced globally.
Yeah.
It became such a phenomenon worldwide. What, 1.3 billion?
Yeah.
In revenue, one of the highest grossing films of all time. And with the ranking in those categories. So, when we think about Chadwick, from what I understand off screen, he was a deep brother. He would have been somebody that I would have hung out with because of the whole cultural and historical depth he had as far as Nile Valley civilizations and history. He was at the Schomburg, learned. He was connected with some people.
Yeah.
Howard,
he sounds like he was a deep brother,
Yeah.
and I'm also, been dedicated to learning more and understanding our history. And he really sounds like a brother who not only studied history but figured out a way to embrace some of that history and incorporate within his lifestyle and even within his work. So it's not surprising the roles that he chose as an actor. It's not surprising. I feel like those roles reflect his level of wokeness, and even what he brought to the table with Black Panther. It was inspirational, which is, these are all the reasons why his loss is really a tragedy. I mean, this is sad. I feel like all the flags need to be half mast right now.
Matter of fact, look.
Right. Seriously.
You know, I appreciate it's amazing. I always say God orchestrates our steps. And as we think about Chadwick, it brings to mind one of my heroes, Muhammad Ali said. He said, I believe there's a quote from Muhammad Ali that says, "Don't count the days, make the days count."
Yeah.
And when we think about Chadwick Boseman, we look at his life, 43, dying from colon cancer, certainly a tragedy. He, gone too soon, died prematurely. But when we look at this concept of making the days count, man, he made the days count,
I mean, I've diagnosed people with colon cancer, plenty of times, more times than I would like. I mean, I take no joy in telling people like you have colon cancer. I've seen people go through treatment. I've seen, people have their colon cancer completely removed and completely treated, but I have not seen anyone put in the type of work that he must have been putting in for him to star in all those movies while carrying this weight on his shoulders and while going through chemotherapy. I mean, he was going through treatment
and surgery.
He had surgeries. Yet he's still, starring in these movies. And, the Hollywood lifestyle, like, I know a lot of people think it's glamorous and glitzy and everything, but a lot of those people put in work to be on those movies. I mean, you're talking 12, 16 days where, you really don't have any control of your schedule. You're just showing up and acting day in, day out. It is a lifestyle that not everybody is, capable of living, but he did it while dealing with a condition which a lot of people struggle with. And, when you think about examples of tenacity and how to persevere despite adversity, I feel like he is one of the best examples we could draw upon. And I would put him in the same category as the Muhammad Ali's and some of the heroes that I grew up looking up to, and I hope my kids also, seek to emulate a brother like himself.
Yeah, man. He, wow. I'm still, taken back. I think, like you said, we're all still mourning, but the takeaway for African Americans, of course, as we look at African American public health data and African American, not just African American public health data, from my perspective, and I think it's obvious, and I think you'll receive this point well. When we look at public health data, it's all focused on the problem.
The
incidences of chronic diseases and various conditions, metabolic syndrome conditions, and now COVID-19 to add to that, right? But for me, I see, and I've received a vision for African Americans around public health success. Because public health data is all around problems. And for me, 2020 represents the public health pivot for African Americans, meaning we can go from focusing on problems to focusing on the potential. God's biology has potential for health residing inside the cell. And I want us to talk about that potential from telomeres to sirtuins. But of course, given your specialty, you deal with the gut, you deal with the microbiome, you deal with intestinal health, the colon.
Yeah.
What is colorectal cancer?
Okay. So colorectal cancer, or cancer in general. Let's start with what is cancer. And I like to ask that question primarily because years ago when I was a medical student, I was volunteered at a clinic called Project Brotherhood here in the South Side of Chicago. So Project Brotherhood was a clinic for Black men. It was ran by Black men, for Black men, and I came there as a Black male medical student because I was at Northwestern for medical school at that time. I didn't have any Black faculty teaching me. So I'm in this class, one of the few Black men in the class, and I didn't see anyone who looks like me. So I almost had kind of an existential crisis, you know what I mean? I'm trying to join this field, the field of medicine, but I didn't really feel like I belonged because I didn't really see anybody. So I was in school. I mean, I was doing well in school, but it was just going through the motions. I didn't really feel at home on the path that I was on. So I needed to really see some brothers who looked like me. And that's how I got linked up with Project Brotherhood. I actually just went on Google and started Googling Black male physician in Chicago. And somehow I got linked up with them. And around that time, they had a grant for the American Cancer Society. And the grant was focusing on educating Black men in Chicago about colon cancer. And what we ended up doing, we ended up training barbers as health educators. So we went to a bunch of different barbershops on the South Side, taught the barbers about colon cancer and everything. And then we even given the barbers the fecal coat cards so they can pass out to their patrons, and the patrons can actually just mail them into the Cook County hospital system. And we would let people know if they actually had blood in their stool. So it was a beautiful program, a beautiful clinic. We even had barbers in the clinic. So, brothers would come in just to go see the doctor and get a haircut while they're waiting. And we didn't wear white coats. So literally all the doctors, I mean, at that time, everybody had on baggy jeans and Timberland boots and whatnot. This is pre the skinny jean era. This is, we were a little old school back then. But it was just a beautiful experience, man. And it's one of the experiences that got me interested in colon cancer, because I was leading some of the focus groups for a lot of the men in the community. So I had to ask them, what questions such as, what is cancer? We really need to know the community's understanding of what's going on in order to come up with the appropriate intervention. So I remember asking some brothers, what is cancer? And the answers that I got, even though this was over 20 years ago, I would not forget this experience, because these are the experiences that I bring to the clinic when I'm starting to see people. So, one brother was just like, well, cancer is a fungus. It's a fungus that grows on you, and that's what it is. Another brother is like, well, cancer is what the doctor says when they're trying to kill you. So when somebody says you have cancer, they just want to put you on chemotherapy, and that's what's going to kill you. Or another brother was just like, well, cancer is what the doctor says when they don't know what's going on. So they'll just say cancer. And then another person was like, cancer is just an infection. So what I realized in that moment, there's a lot of folks that just don't know what cancer is. And I wouldn't say that's to any fault of their own. This is information that's just not taught in the public school system. I'm a physician. And if I think back about what I learned about medicine or healthcare in elementary school, junior high school, high school, it's not a whole lot. We really didn't have classes talking about cancer.
Help the audience, though, and pardon me for interjecting, but help the audience, because I know, as I've read, about cancer, it's described as uncontrolled mitosis.
Yeah.
Explain what cancer is in a very as fundamental as you can make it.
Yeah. So cancer is when cells are growing and replicating in an uncontrolled fashion. Okay. So, although I'm a man of science, I'm also a man of faith. And I feel like the science and the faith go hand in hand. And you sound like a brother who's rooted in history. A lot of the scientists were also some of the religious leaders once upon a time. So you think about Imhotep and going back to Kemet and Nubia, science and religion and faith were linked. So there, within our body, we have DNA, and DNA is the blueprint that tells the cells what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. Now, in our environment, there are a lot of toxins and chemicals that we can be exposed to that can potentially damage our DNA. Even certain viruses can damage the DNA. So, I mean, if you think about a virus that can lead to cancer, HPV would be a good example of that. So HPV, that virus can inject itself within the DNA of some of our cells and lead to abnormal cell growth that can lead to cervical cancer and penile cancer in men. So that's just one example, but the virus in of itself has a toxic effect on DNA. So what happens, DNA, specifically the portions of our DNA that control how cells are supposed to replicate, or if there is a defect in the DNA, sometimes the cells have a signal where they can recognize that there's something wrong with the DNA. And in that situation, the cell is supposed to die. It's supposed to essentially commit suicide. So we have
apoptosis.
Apoptosis, exactly. And I used to do research on apoptosis when I was in medical school. I used to work in a lab and do basic science research. So the fact that we have all these mechanisms within us, I mean, it is amazing. It is really amazing when you think about like the amount of detail that has been put into our body in order for things to work. It is, it is mind-boggling. Like we are more complicated than the most complicated computer, hands down. And not only we are, but like any living creature. Even like the simple, single-celled organisms, super duper complicated. So with cancer, the mechanisms that prevent the cells from going crazy or prevent the cells from passing on mutations, those mechanisms have been impacted. And now cells can replicate and grow out of control. And what happens, you can accumulate more mutations, and that's gonna, make something go from a precancerous condition to actually a cancerous condition. And cancer, essentially, these cells are growing in such an uncontrolled fashion, they can start growing into other organs. So a cancer may originate in the colon, but if those cancer cells get into the bloodstream, they can flow through our bloodstream and land in other parts of the body. And that's what we call metastasis.
Is that how Brother Chadwick Boseman went from stage 3 to stage 4?
Yeah. So with the stages really just reflect the size, the location, and whether or not the tumor has spread or invaded into other organs or other parts of the body. So I know a lot of people talk about stage 3 versus stage 4. Stage 4, he basically just had distant metastasis. So it spread to organs, far, not just organs adjacent to the colon. It spread to other parts of the body, even far away from the colon. So with African Americans, and colon cancer specifically originates within the colon, also called the large intestine. So it's good to know this terminology. And I actually wrote a book for kids breaking down some of the body parts of the intestinal anatomy, primarily because there's a lot of adults that I see who still don't understand this terminology. And again, it's not any fault in their own. This is stuff that's just not taught. But if we are trying to be advocates or health advocates for ourselves, you have to have a certain vocabulary to even know what you're advocating for. If you don't have the vocabulary, you can't be an advocate.
You can't even think about it. You can't even understand it or think about it if you don't understand the meaning of the words. So speaking of which, I read that cancer of the colon first starts with the formation of a polyp.
Yes.
What types of foods trigger the formation of a polyp?
Okay. So that's a complicated question, but a polyp in of itself is a precancerous lesion. Okay, so it is the product of mutations. So there's DNA mutations that lead to polyps, but the cells within polyps are not growing so rapidly, so uncontrolled. They're not spreading all over the place. They're just localized to the actual polyp. But if another mutation occurs within that cell, then they eventually transition from being precancerous cells to a cancer. So when we talk about a transition from precancerous to cancerous, we're really talking about accumulating more mutations, more or less. So now we have to think about, well, what foods actually are exposed to the lining of the colon that can actually damage the DNA within the cells that line our intestines. Okay, so now we're jumping into it. Okay. So I tell people we got to not only think about the food that we're eating, we have to think about the ways in which we're preparing it. We have to think about the containers, the vessels that contain the food, and whether or not those chemicals can actually get into the food and subsequently get into us. We have to think about what happened to the food before it even became food. Did it come from plants that were sprayed with pesticides that in itself can be toxic to our DNA? Did it come from animals that may have been fed any number of antibiotics that those antibiotic residues can actually exist within the food itself and then get into our colon and intestines and essentially kill off some of the bacteria that live in our intestines, because these are antibiotics. So food is very, very complicated. It has a story. And I think if we're trying to really understand how food is increasing our risk for developing colon cancer, we have to understand the story of food itself. So in terms of foods, we do know that red meat particularly may increase the risk of colon cancer. And, the key word is may. So there's nothing 100% certain in medicine to some degree, primarily because to do some of the studies that would have to be done to say red meat causes cancer, you'd have to do some unethical stuff. I mean, you'd have to take like little babies and feed them red meat, and it'd have to be thousands of them for their entire life, and have people where you have on a plant-based diet who've never had any meat. And then you start looking at outcomes, and you start looking to see, well, the red meat people, they had a whole bunch of cancer, and the plant-based people, they didn't. So we don't have, any studies like that, because that would be unethical. We have population studies where we can make some, assumptions, and that's the best we could do. And then we also have, there's like basic science studies where you could expose, cells to some of the chemicals from red meat and see what happens and see if they transition to cancer. And then you also have mice studies, but again, mice aren't really people. So whatever information we extrapolate from mice, we have to understand that, it's still a mouse. They're not entirely the same. There's some overlap, but not the same. So with food, we know that red meat, particularly because red meat has heme within it, the heme can be toxic to the cells. So heme is the chemical that gives red meat its red color. So it's in beef, lamb, pork, and it also may be in duck breast. So duck breast, I'm a chef, so I went to culinary school. So duck breast technically is a red meat because it does have some heme in it. And the duck breast, if you ever seen a duck breast, is red in color. And other foods that have been associated with colon cancer are also the processed meats. Okay, so the processed meats, they start off red meat, but then we start processing them to make them last a little bit longer. So we add
jelly cuts, bologna,
sausages, bacon. So they have preservatives, specifically nitrites, that also have been associated with increased risk of cancer, and also they potentially can even cause some of the DNA mutations that we've been talking about. So other foods that have been associated with cancer, with the red meat, we can potentially even make them more already carcinogenic or cancer promoting than what they already are by the way we cook them. So when we grill meat or cook meat at high temperatures, okay, so those high heat cooking techniques, which would include grilling, deep frying, roasting meat at high temperature. So what those techniques do, they cause what's known as the Maillard reaction. Okay, so that's when the skin or the actual flesh from the meat itself starts to turn brown and black and change colors. So, a lot of people, we do that intentionally because it adds flavor. So,
But you're referring to the heterocyclic amines?
yeah. So when we char meat, within that, the black grill marks and the char itself, there are chemicals that can potentially cause cancer. So two common chemicals would be polyaromatic hydrocarbons and heterocyclic amines. And both of those are increased when we're, basically cooking animal flesh with high heats. Now, when we cook vegetables, when you roast your broccoli and all that stuff, it doesn't generate the same chemicals, even though it has a nice little char.
Let me interject just so the audience can understand. I want to unpack that because I'm a nutrition performance coach. So part of what I do is I study the science, and then I break it down and make it so relatable that everybody gets it.
Yeah.
So what you just described was the browning or the blackening or the darkening of meat. Say, for instance, one of the days out of the year that is sacred for African Americans would be 4th of July, Independence Day. And the amount of barbecuing and grilling of meat single-handedly on that day, the darkening of meat, the blackening of meat. I wonder what's going on days like that and days following where there are leftovers, where, for one, red meat and other meats, and I want to ask you about this, there's a IGF-1 or insulin-like growth factor 1 connection with cancer and meat consumption. And my question is, and I want to tie it back into this practice that many Americans have, especially African Americans, when it comes to the amount of meat consumed and the blackening of that meat because of that way of preparing food on a grill.
Yeah. It is. So now we're getting into a deep conversation. And we're getting a conversation in terms of, when does health supersede culture and celebration? And how do we navigate, celebrating, especially if that celebration can have negative impacts on our health? And that's a tough question. It really is. So, on the one hand, my family's from the South. So even though I live off a plant-based diet, my love of cooking and my skill set for cooking did not come from a plant-based family. It came from a family that was rooted in the South and rooted in Southern culture. And, a lot of people get surprised. I'm probably one of the best barbecue chefs in Chicago, even though I'm plant-based. But, if you have me on the grill, on the smoker, I can crank out some good barbecue, primarily because I come from a long tradition of barbecuers. But I don't do that anymore because I recognize that it's just not the healthiest thing for this black male body. However, I don't want to judge folks who do, and it's tough. And it's for me, I would say grilling meat all the time. If summertime comes along and you're grilling every single day in the summer, that's probably not a good thing. That's probably not.
I agree with you, but I think right now there's so much talk about Black lives mattering, and of course, I'm African American. You're African American.
Yeah,
my Black lives really do matter.
Yeah,
but the reality of it is we have to say, all right, let's get real and say, all right, for me as a nutrition performance coach, somebody that respects, I call this God's biology, all of us are inhabiting.
Yeah.
There comes a time, and I would say this is that time, where African Americans have an opportunity to create a new public health story.
That's true.
If we look back over the past several decades, the African American public health history has not been favorable. It's been, we could call it at best, the period of metabolic syndrome conditions and premature death. And so we've got to get serious. If we're saying Black Lives Matter, I've been saying it all year and even last year. Okay, if you really believe that individually, it's time to eat like you matter.
Yeah.
Before homicide, which is one of the leading causes of death of African Americans, it's within the top 10 list, homicide.
Yeah, but it pales in comparison to cancer.
Correct.
Heart disease, strokes.
Food slavery is the number one responsible for heart disease. Number one, number two, number three. I know one of them is not diet related, chronic disease, accidents fall in there. Maybe 3 or 4. My point is, yes, Black lives do matter. However, one of the most powerful ways to demonstrate that, where on a personal level, we've got to begin to eat like we matter, because chronic diseases have been taking us out. And now we have a viral infection mixed with pre-existing medical conditions or metabolic syndrome conditions.
Yeah.
And obesity being one of those metabolic syndrome conditions, abdominal obesity, central obesity. Now, viral infections are exacerbating the situation. So there comes a time where we have to say, look, okay, Black lives do matter. Let's begin to eat like we matter and concentrate on, when we think about the African American population, we gotta pivot from problems to potential, because God's biology has health potential. And by most African Americans, there's an opportunity that African Americans have right now to adopt a plant-based eating style that's fiber rich, and phytoceutical rich in phytoceuticals or phytonutrients, because that's going to be our key to pivoting, so that over the next couple decades, we can see the incidences of heart disease, the incidences of obesity, the incidences of cancers, all different types of cancers, whether it's ovarian, breast, colon cancer, prostate cancer. There is opportunity for the incidences of these diseases to decline. And it's going to take conversations like this. It's going to take people like yourself and myself who are on the front of bottom-up change. Because let's be honest, the medical community in the literature would have us perceive and believe that you can only increase your risk for cancer or any other chronic disease or decrease your risk. I don't believe that. That's BS. I believe we can eliminate risk altogether. And so God's biology, we can eat in a manner that activates those genes and produce and make proteins that are healthy proteins versus C-reactive proteins. Whole foods, plant-based diet, genes to create healthy proteins. We know processed foods and meat, animal product consumption gets the genes to make C-reactive proteins.
Right, and processed foods, specifically ultra-processed foods, also have been associated with colon cancer. And for the average American, not just the Black American, even the white American, average American, 60% of our calories come from ultra-processed foods.
Facts.
And the only groups that, in general, in mass, eat less processed foods are the groups that are closer to immigration. So a lot of Asian Americans and a lot of Latino Americans, if they are immigrants or parents are immigrants, they have a higher likelihood of eating less ultra-processed foods. But for Black and white people in America, we eat the same old junk. It's the same amount of processed foods. And, what's interesting, a lot of times people come up to me and ask me questions like, oh, well, don't Black people eat different than white people? In America, it's not a big difference.
No,
it's not like, we're on the soul food diet that we ate once upon a time. In America, the average person's eating junk food, period. Like French fries, burgers, You
Correct.
know, all the fried snacks and all that stuff, that has nothing to do with, foods that we've been eating in America historically. This is all fast food and consumer based. It's a consumer based diet.
What is the USDA? What is it? 54% of calories in the average American's diet is derived from calorie-rich and processed foods, or ultra-processed foods, as you're calling it, and what, 33 or 34% from animal products.
Yeah.
And then the 12%, roughly 12 to 14% category is plant-based, but then juices in that category. And so
Which
really,
is
technically,
really just a processed food.
correct. So technically, the average American is really, at best, deriving maybe 6% of their calories from whole, unprocessed, plant-based foods that are fiber and micronutrient dense.
Right. And I'm glad we're having this conversation, because it I want to talk about how I view health disparities. Okay. So, and you also brought up how you got issues of some of the public health researchers just pointing out the problem. And I too have similar issues. I feel like you have people making a whole career of just saying Black people are struggling.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't reverse anything.
It doesn't reverse anything. It's also nothing that your average Black person can't see for themselves. Like I live in Chicago.
Firsthand.
Like I don't have to walk but a couple blocks outside of my house to see how real the struggle is. And I don't necessarily have to read a journal article to point out what we already know. Even with the whole COVID situation, you think there were any Black people or any Black physicians who are surprised by the fact that COVID is affecting people of color more so than everybody else? It's not a surprise.
Right.
But what bothers me with health disparities researchers, they always present the difference between Black people and white people as if white people in America are the standard bearers for health. And white people in America are eating the standard American diet, which is super duper unhealthy. And compared to other people throughout the globe, including white people, like white Americans don't have higher amounts of longevity, don't have less colon cancer. We have more of this stuff, than other groups. So the goal, I mean, this is a conversation that the average American, not just Black American, the average American would benefit from. It's just that for whatever reason, this standard American diet has, we reap the negative impact of the standard American diet more so than other groups. And there's a lot of different factors that go along into it. Okay. So I don't want to say whatever reason, there's a lot of different reasons. I mean, and some of those reasons stem from racism. So it's just like, not only do we have the eating the same food, we have to have this diet in the context of a nation infused with structural racism.
Correct. Which is now the emotional aspect, and how emotions of stress epigenetically elevate blood pressure, can turn on cancer. If you're feeling more sorrow than other ethnic groups, feeling more sad, feeling more emotional stress from watching footage on television of African American men and Black women being shot, all of that is epigenetically impacting our genes.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you brought up epigenetics, and this is where I call people out a lot. So oftentimes, I'll come in a room and give a talk. People invite me to give a talk somewhere, and I'll talk about the impact of structural racism on Black health. And someone will say something in the audience like, well, I know racism exists, but I don't want, Black people to think that, racism is solely to blame for everything, and that they're not genetically at increased risk for some of these diseases. And a lot of people just assume that genetics, our genes are free from experiencing racism. And that it's not true. So due to what you just mentioned, the epigenetic changes, the environmental exposure to racism has a potential to negatively impact our own DNA. And that can be passed on from generation to generation. So it's hard to even comment how much of this stuff is genetically due to being Black, or genetically the product of living Black. You see what I'm saying?
I agree 100%. I know another variable, just to add to that, vitamin D deficiency.
It's interesting. So
And
vitamin D, it's interesting, and I feel like we need to do more research on vitamin D. And I'm a proponent of trying to normalize vitamin D. However, the story is more complicated than what's typically presented, and even in most physician nutrition circles. So there was an interesting study in the New England Journal. You should look it up. New England Journal of Medicine. They looked at racial differences in vitamin D and vitamin D binding protein. This study probably came out in 2010, 2011 or so. And I know about it because I was doing some vitamin D research at that time. So what the study found was that Black people, we had more biologically active vitamin D, more free vitamin D to actually carry out activities than other groups did. So less of our vitamin D was bound by vitamin D binding protein, and a higher ratio was actually free to function. So even though if you checked someone's vitamin D level who's African American, their level may actually be lower, but the amount that was actually available to be biologically active based upon the study was similar to groups that had higher vitamin D levels. And the groups who had higher vitamin D levels, they actually had more of this vitamin D binding protein. So less of their vitamin D was actually available for the body to use. But when you check the vitamin D levels, the test that we use to check vitamin D doesn't really discern from free vitamin D versus bound vitamin D. So it was an interesting study.
Well, that's an interesting nuance that I've never heard. I know what's more mainstream, standing around vitamin D in African Americans is that when African Americans are deficient in vitamin D, their risk for cancer increases.
Not just African Americans. I mean, anybody, which is one of the reasons why I try to normalize people's vitamin D, but I don't try to push it too high, because if our vitamin D levels go too high, that potentially can increase the risk of kind of calcium plaques building up in our arteries. So it's just like, how do you balance us, especially in America, where we may be exposed on average to foods and a lifestyle that can increase our risk of developing strokes and heart attacks. But if we push vitamin D too high in that context, that may not necessarily be the healthy thing. Well, so I agree, our vitamin D should not be low. And vitamin D in and of itself definitely has been associated with not only excess weight gain, issues with cancer, maybe issues with fighting off certain infections. So we definitely should be cognizant of the role that vitamin D can play in our body. However, I do think there's a lot of nuances that we need to tease out a little bit more. And
but what about, I mean, most, and you've informed me in some of those nuances, and I appreciate the discussion. I mean, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna look that up. That's neat.
Yeah, and I tell everybody, look it up.
This ties into another statistic, which is a risk factor: inactivity. And looking at the data, public health data, African Americans are leading in the category of the most inactive racial or ethnic group.
Yeah.
If we go to any major city, I reside in Charlotte. I think you reside in Chicago.
Yeah.
If I go outside and if I go from block to block to block just to see who's working out outside, it's way more Caucasians. Yeah. So when I look at the data, I can see by the lack of representation of Black folks outside working out what the data on a macro level indicates, which is, we're the most inactive ethnic and racial group. But what ties to that is lack of sunlight exposure.
Yeah.
So you got two variables that actually go hand in hand, because if you're more active and you go outside and go for more walks and go for jogs and ride your bicycle, you're going to get more sunlight.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree with that. I mean, we need sunlight exposure, hands down. And
That's
when we
what we
get our
get out of
vitamin
the
D, when we get our vitamin D from the sun naturally, you're not going to worry about vitamin D toxicity. Okay.
correct,
Like
correct,
it's not going to happen.
correct.
Uh, so, living a lifestyle where you're getting exposed to vitamin D as much as you can. I mean, depending on where you are in the country, that's tough. If you live in Chicago, certainly, it's not a whole lot of sunlight for a significant portion of the year. But, nonetheless, you still have to do your best. And sometimes, those winter months, I'm not against people, doing some vitamin D supplementation. But hands down, getting it the natural way is the best way.
That's right.
And that applies to almost every single supplement you could think of. I know a lot of people when they first venture out into the world of wellness and trying to be healthier, for a lot of folks, their first stop is the supplements. Like, okay, well, what type of supplement should I be on, and what type of vitamin should I be taking?
Healthy foods.
And the truth of the matter is, everything you need is in the food. And there's a lot of studies that have been demonstrated that sometimes some of these supplements can actually put us at risk for harm. So not only are they not necessarily doing what they're intended to be doing, because there's a lot of marketing issues out here where you think you're taking some supplement and they say it has X ingredient, but when you actually study it, it actually doesn't have that ingredient in there at all. It may be something totally different. But even still, there's been a lot of studies where they looked at the supplements and their ability to increase, vitamins and whatnot, and they're not as effective as just getting it from the food itself. Primarily because, when we make these supplements, this is man's attempt to simplify something that's exceedingly complicated. Okay, so like we can't replicate, the exact mineral component of, kale and all these natural vegetables. Like there's no like man-made kale pill that you can just create.
Yeah.
But when
Can't
we
outdo God. Can't outdo God. And look, no matter. Yes, I can hear you. I was making the point that no matter how advanced we are in nutritional science, no powder or pill can outdo what God made in terms of fruits in their natural state and form, and leafy greens and other colored vegetables. I have a question.
Yeah.
And it's going to be very specific. So we know there's evidence that indicates that a diet high in calorie rich and processed foods or ultra processed foods and animal products reduces healthy gut flora, especially sugar, like white sugar and cooked oils.
Yeah.
And so when gut flora is compromised or reduced and there's more dangerous bacteria in the gut, how does that impact polyps? How does that impact, from an accumulative standpoint and over time, how does that impact the formation of colorectal cancer?
Yeah. So understanding the importance of the bacteria in the gut is a relatively new field, but it's an important field. And what I like about it, so back in the 90s, we put all this money in the Human Genome Project. And as it stands, the Human Genome Project hasn't really yielded much. Like we haven't cured sickle cell. We haven't cured, some of the cystic fibrosis and, some of these clearly genetic conditions. But primarily because it's hard to manipulate our DNA. We just don't know how to manipulate it all that well, at least not through science. Now, when it comes to the bacteria in our gut, what's fascinating about the bacteria within our gut is that we actually have more DNA within the population of bacteria within the gut than we have in our entire body. There's more bacterial cells in our gut than human cells in our entire body. And what's fascinating, we know the bacteria, they digest food that we don't digest well. They produce nutrients that we can subsequently digest. They produce hormones. They produce proteins and amino acids that are precursors to different neurotransmitters, so they can affect our mood. They can, contribute to anxiety, depression, maybe even conditions like schizophrenia. We also know that the bacteria interact with our own immune system. What's lying in the colon. So the colon and the gut in general this is the largest immune organ in the body.
Say that one more time. Please say that one more time.
The gut is the largest immune organ in the body, and it's the largest endocrine organ in the body. So, the gut is, when you think about something that's foundational to human health, the gut is really the foundation. So the heart and all this and the brain and everything is important. We need all that stuff. But in terms of what is the basement that's upholding the human body, it's really the gut, because what goes on in the gut affects everything.
Is it a processing plant?
It is a processing plant. It serves so many different functions. Okay, so you want to talk about processing, it does that. But you want to talk about barrier function in terms of being a security guard. It is also the security guard. So it is the body's defense against letting in foreign invaders. So just like our skin is, the lining of the gut is. But the lining of the gut is way more complicated than the lining of the skin, because it has to pick and choose what to let in and what not to let in. So we have to let in our nutrients and the foods that we're consuming. So the gut selectively has to say, well, this right here, I could tell you came from kale, you're not a bacteria. Or this bacteria, you're a bacteria, I can't let you in the body. Or this bacteria, you know what? You have historically been here, you're part of our healthy gut flora, it's okay for you to hang around. So within our gut is the ability to actually decide what is a foreign invader and what's not a foreign invader. And also, if we identify a foreign invader like a bacteria or a virus, the gut has the ability to actually attack that invader and prevent it from causing damage. And within that attack, we have to shut off the attack, because if the gut and the immune system within the gut is attacking something, and that inflammation that's created to actually kill whatever foreign invader or bacteria is trying to get in the body, if that goes unchecked, that's how that manifests itself as autoimmune conditions, such as inflammatory bowel disease or Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, where the colon is just constantly inflamed because the body is constantly trying to attack a foreign invader that may or may not even be there.
I have a question for you too.
Yes. Yeah, why don't you go ahead?
So I asked you about a polyp earlier.
Yeah.
But let me see if I can tie it in. I'm trying to understand the mechanisms.
Yeah.
What actually goes on from point A to colorectal cancer.
Yeah.
What's the relationship between the decrease in healthy gut flora, increase of bad bacteria in the gut, polyps, inflammation, and full-blown colorectal cancer?
Yeah. So the connection is not clearly established. So that is an ongoing area of research. But what is established, we know that having a diverse population of gut bacteria is healthy. Okay. And like we say good and bad bacteria, but I think that oversimplifies something that's extremely complicated. But what I try to press upon people, you have to have a variety of different types of bacteria. Diversity is good. Diversity is good when it comes to people. It's good when it comes to bacteria. And
the bacteria generated from ultra-processed food consumption. We don't need that bacteria, right?
Well, so ultra-processed foods and some of the fatty foods and the foods that you mentioned, they actually decrease the diversity of bacteria overall. So I think the main negative impact that they have, instead of talking about good and bad bacteria, I think to really just keep it simple yet in line with the existing science that we have, like those foods decrease the diversity of our bacteria in general, and that's bad. And then some foods can impact the bacteria in such a way where we process bile acids in such a way that's actually harmful to the colon. So our body, we generate bile acids, and the bile acids help us digest fat. So, you need some bile acids.
From the liver.
But there are certain types of bacteria that can convert those bile acids that live within us and produce within us into something that's a little bit toxic to the lining of the colon. And that is potentially one of the mechanisms that, bacteria can contribute to colon cancer. However, the bacteria also can, interact with our immune system. And our immune system plays a role as the check and balance against cancer. So if the bacteria are in interacting with the immune system in such a way that one promotes chronic inflammation, that inflammation in and of itself can lead to some DNA damage. And so there's a lot of different ways and venues in which the bacteria in the gut can contribute to cancer. So it's probably not going to be just one way. It's probably a myriad of ways. But nonetheless, what I like about the bacteria, it is a variable that we know we can change. And one of the easiest and clearly established ways to change that variable is the foods that we eat. And the best way to actually create a healthy combination of bacteria is not taking probiotics. It's not taking all these supplements. It is eating food that will feed the gut bacteria. And what food am I talking about? I'm not talking about Cheetos and Flamin' Hots. I'm not talking about, grilled meats. And I'm not even talking about the Impossible Burger and some of the artificial foods that we use as meat substitutes for plant-based diets. I'm talking about the simple, naturally occurring fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts, and whole grains. And foods that, if we can get them as close to their whole food natural form as possible, this is the stuff that really has the biggest impact, not only on our body, but also the bacteria that exists within our body. And the way I look at bacteria, fundamentally, I'm a nerd at the end of the day. So I'm into not only, Black Panther and the Marvel stuff, but also some of the sci-fi movies. And, one of the movies that really got me interested in sci-fi was Star Wars. So Star Wars, came out, many years ago, but I remember watching, Star Wars when I was younger, and I was just like mesmerized. I never seen anything like it.
Back in the 70s.
So I remember seeing like all the Star Wars, and one thing within Star Wars is this concept of where the Force comes from. So the Force comes from these little organisms that live inside of us called midichlorians. So these little organisms, if someone has a lot of midichlorians, the Force is going to be strong in them. For whatever reason, I view our bacteria the same way I view those midichlorians, okay? So you want to have a healthy combination of bacteria that is essentially going to contribute to a healthy life force, if you will. So the best way to keep that bacteria healthy is minimizing exposure to antibiotics, especially unnecessarily exposure. So the 70s, 80s, 90s, I feel like America, we went antibiotic crazy to the point where now half the antibiotics don't even work because all the bacteria are resistant to them. And we also probably have damaged our own, gut microbiomes unknowingly. I can't say it was intentional. It's just that we didn't know the science back then. And it's something that only now, we just now got to the point where we're combating and convincing people like, okay, you really don't need an antibiotic for every cough that, comes your way, or every sniffle that comes your way. You don't necessarily need an antibiotic for that. But for the most part, people, in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, like that was the go-to. Like, oh, you have cough, just here's some amoxicillin. But that lifestyle and that practice, wreaked havoc on everybody's microbiomes. So I tell people, I'm not anti-antibiotic. I'm a physician. There are some situations where, like, yeah, you need antibiotic. But the problem is we know that antibiotics are being overused.
Over prescribed. I read that.
Yeah, overprescribed. And a lot, and I would say even to the point where it's irresponsible. And some of that, there's some component of demand. People are coming into the clinic asking for antibiotics. And there's also some component of, like, some physicians just don't even know what they're doing. And they're just giving it out without even thinking about the implications of what they're doing. And that's just the reality of it. But the other variable is really the foods that we eat. So for the best thing you can do is just eat a healthy diet. You don't have to spend, money on probiotics. I see people going to spend like $100 a month on probiotics, and they're like, this has 1 billion, units of lactobacilli. Like, you don't need all that. You just need to eat a bunch of different fruits and vegetables. That's it.
We would be remiss. I would be remiss if I did not ask you to discuss the study that they did where they took a group of African-born people,
yes,
in a population of African Americans, and they put the African Americans on the African diet and the African people on the African American. Will you please share that study?
Yeah. So this was a study that came out in 2015 by a researcher, Stephen O'Keefe. And I remember the first time I came across the study, I was at one of our gastroenterology conferences. So they have this big conference called Digestive Disease Week where, literally almost all the gastroenterologists in the world show up for Digestive Disease Week. I mean, it's a massive conference. And I think we were doing it in San Diego, the same convention center where they have Comic-Con and whatnot in San Diego. So you got all these gastroenterologists in San Diego, and I'm looking at all the different lectures that are going on. I think I was giving a couple lectures myself that year. And I see this talk by Stephen O'Keefe, and it's just like, fiber, fat, diet, and risk of colon cancer in African Americans and rural Africans. And I'm like, wait, let me go see what Stephen O'Keefe is talking about. And I remember being in the audience where he started going through the design and the premise of the article of the study. So the premise was Black people in rural South Africa. So we're talking about the Zulus. Okay, so a lot of folks are familiar with Shaka Zulu. We were talking about the descendants of Shaka Zulu. So in rural South Africa, and one of the Zulus, I mean, if you know their story, that's an amazing group of individuals. So Shaka Zulu got his claim to fame. I mean, he was fighting off colonizers who had weapons, and they didn't have guns. They just had, spears and stuff like that. And they fought a whole war and pretty much won, which is deep. But nonetheless, they were in rural South Africa, the rates of colon cancer is less than like 5 people per 100,000 people develop colon cancer. Within African Americans, depending on where you're at, it can be as high as 65 people per 100,000 developing colon cancer. So the question is, how is it that our genetic brothers and sisters in South Africa, how are they, experiencing way less colon cancer than we are? Like, what is going on? And Stephen O'Keefe, he hypothesized that there was a difference in diet, okay? And he wanted to test this hypothesis, and he created a brilliant study where he basically looked at the composition of bacteria and gut bacteria in people in rural South Africa. And he also looked at their diet and how much fiber it contained and what people were eating, what they weren't eating. And he looked at what's known as potential markers that indicated increased risk for colon cancer. And one of the markers that he looked at was how rapidly were cells multiplying and turning over in the colon. So you can do special tests. If I did a biopsy of the colon, you can actually do special tests on your biopsy or the cells from the colon to actually see how quickly how rapidly they're turning over. And we know that whenever cells turn over rapidly, the possibility for mistakes in DNA replication. So when you have to, make a new cell, you got to replicate the DNA. And if the body's doing that over and over and over again, every time you replicate DNA, the opportunity for a mistake happens. Okay, an opportunity for an error in that DNA, which that error could be a mutation. If that happens and now you're passing that mutation on to other cells that are turning over and over and over again, eventually, you can start developing polyps. So what they found was in Africans, rural South Africans, their diet had markedly more fiber than ours. I mean, up to like 50 grams of fiber per day.
Be more specific. Fiber, I know, but tell the audience, when you say fiber, you're talking specifically about what types of foods?
So it's plant-based foods, and a lot of their fiber came from resistant starch, which they were doing a porridge called high maize flour. Okay, so it is like, so in the United States, we're doing cream of wheat. Cream of wheat is really just a processed. It's a processed food at the end of the day. This, it has a similar texture to cream of wheat, but it's not processed. So they were making porridge out of it, and it's super duper high in resistant starch. I mean, it's one of the highest forms of highest foods with resistant starch out there. And resistant starch is just, another form of fiber at the end of the day. So what they found, the South Africans on their natural diet, their cells were turning over, slower than the African Americans on the standard American diet. And their bacteria, they had a more diverse composition of bacteria, okay? And they also had less of the bacteria that would convert bile acids into something more toxic. So what they did was they were like, okay, well, we know that these differences already exist. That's not surprising. We know that African Americans have a higher rate of developing colon cancer. So of course we're going to see these differences to begin with. But let's see if we can induce, if we can put Africans on the standard American diet and, see if that changes things to make their gut, the environment of the gut, seem more similar to that of an African American. And also, let's see if we can take an African American and put them on that South African diet and see if we can actually create the changes in their gut to make their gut more similar to the rural Africans, okay? So what they found was, after 2 weeks of rural Africans being on a standard American diet, their cells started to turn over as rapid as the African Americans were on the standard American diet. Their bacteria started to become less diverse and also more toxic. And that was only within 2 weeks. Now, the flip side, what I like about it is that they put the African Americans on that rural African diet rich in fiber. And as a matter of fact, if you go on my Facebook page, no, I'm sorry, my Instagram page, I have a post where I actually took a picture of what the African American or the standard American diet looks like, what they actually fed the Africans to actually increase their risk of developing colon cancer. So people should see it. I mean, it's nothing crazy. It was just like hamburgers, French fries, sausages, bacon, and all the regular stuff that a lot of people are eating. So when they took the African Americans and they put them on their real South African diet that was rich with fiber, they found that their cell turnover decreased and it slowed down. And they use that as a marker to say, well, like, their risk of developing colon cancer has probably decreased because the cells are now functioning differently when they're on this diet. And they also found that the bacteria within the African American gut became more diverse on a fiber-rich diet. So it's not surprising. I mean, in order for the bacteria to thrive, you have to feed the bacteria. And how do you feed the bacteria? You feed the bacteria foods that don't really get absorbed and degraded and digested, and they actually end up in the colon where predominantly most of our bacteria live. And now, once those fiber-rich foods end up in the bacteria can digest them and convert them into short-chain fatty acids, which are nutrients that actually the lining of the colon can thrive off of. So those short-chain fatty acids, that is like the fuel for the cells that line the colon. And it really comes from the bacteria that live within the gut. So in order to have a happy gut, you have to have a happy bacteria, a combination of bacteria. And how you make the bacteria happy? You got to feed them. What do you feed them? You feed them fiber. And I'm not talking about the fake fiber that you get in Metamucil or the fake fiber that you get in Benefiber. That doesn't really feed the bacteria as well. Like, I'm talking about the fiber that you get straight from food.
Vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes,
grains. I mean, simple stuff. And, it is sad. I know a lot of times people talk about, oh, Black people, we have higher rates of these conditions because of soul food. The reality is, like, we don't even eat soul food like we used to. And soul food and slave food, now I know there's some overlap, but there's also a lot of differences. So the diet that a lot of African Americans historically grew up in the South, it was a farmer's diet. It was a diet rich with a bunch of, whole grains, a bunch of different types of greens. I
Leafy
know
greens.
leafy greens, and a bunch of beans. And people were not necessarily doing fried chicken and chitlins every single day, despite popular belief. And, with fried chicken, that was really the celebratory meal. It wasn't the everyday plate. It was the, maybe holiday, maybe on Sunday if your family had some money. But to actually, there was no fast food. So most of our grandparents and great grandparents, they didn't grow up on fast food. Like it didn't exist.
It didn't exist.
It didn't exist. And so if you wanted to eat chicken, you had to go kill a chicken. And I mean, I have 3 kids and I do most of the cooking in my household. Do you know like how difficult it would be if I had to go out and kill a chicken just to make dinner? Like after being at work all day, now I have to come home and start killing animals and taking, feathers off and everything. Like, of course, people weren't doing that every single day. The amount of work and the amount of time to do that was not an everyday thing. So, with that, the standard soul food diet that a lot of African Americans, our grandparents and great grandparents grew up on, it wasn't 100% vegetarian, but it was a whole bunch of vegetables in there.
Leafy greens, legumes.
Leafy greens, black eyed peas, black beans, and the leafy greens. We talk about kale as if kale is something new. Like Black people have been living off kale for centuries. And not only kale, but collard greens, turnip greens, mustard greens, Swiss chard, yellow chard, green chard, red chard. I mean, like all that stuff was part of the African American. They were staples in the African American diet. And then somehow, some way, with urbanization, the Great Migration, we moved up to the north to cities like Chicago. I mean, this is how my family got here. With commercialization. So once everything got commercialized and fast food got created, everything changed. And
I don't mean to cut you off, but I don't know if you ever thought about this, but just the fact that you referenced the period in which during the times in which people of African descent in America were enslaved.
Yeah.
Look at the amount of sun exposure they got.
Right.
And so if we take that period, go up 100 years, go up, I wonder if anybody's ever done a study just to say, okay, over hundreds of years, African American sun exposure has definitely decreased.
I mean, that would be a good study to do, just to do it, to confirm it. But hands down, I mean, I can just tell you, like once we moved from the south to the north, just geographically, a lot of our vitamin D and sunlight exposure decreased just off of that alone. And then a lot of people, we have, yeah, and we also, no longer work outdoors. And it's funny when you think about the original farmers, like in the United States, a lot of the farmers, well, obviously you got the Native Americans. And then you had us. We were the farmers, but somehow we lost touch with that connection to the land. And I get it. I mean, we weren't farmers by choice. We were forced to be farmers. So I can understand how, not enjoying and loving things that you were forced to do. But nonetheless, in order to improve the health of ourselves, we have to get a little bit closer to the land and food that's coming from the land, and really developing a healthy relationship with food, not only in consuming healthy foods, but even really thinking about how the food is processed and prepared and how it's farmed, and how those practices can not only impact our body, but also the planet in which we live. So, when we start thinking about health, how to make, us healthy as a people, we also have to think about what that health looks like in the context of the planet in which we live. And that's one of the reasons, that's another reason why you could really have a conversation about the benefits of a plant-based diet. Because, right now with the commercial food industry being such a massive industry where animals are being farmed and they're not even treated like animals, they're just things. And, they're being exposed to massive amounts of antibiotics just to survive in this industrialized fashion. It's like that is just not good for an environment. And we can see this I'm not some conspiracy theorist or anything. Like this is the truth. Oh
Or the
man,
evidence out there.
I'm still here. Something happened.
Oh, I can hear you. I can definitely hear you. The evidence
Okay.
is out there,
Yeah. Sorry about that. I got.
no worries. Factory farmings and implications on our ecology, on our biology, on
Right.
the,
So like case in point, you may see these food advisories how like you can't have romaine lettuce because there's E. coli all in the romaine lettuce. And it's not that romaine lettuce naturally has E. coli. It's that these farms that are growing romaine lettuce are within the same vicinity as farms that are, raising pigs and cattle, where there may be a whole lot of E. coli, salmonella, and the runoff from those farms subsequently, like all the feast and the wastewater and all that stuff, can run off on the farms that are growing fruits and vegetables. So all the E. coli that is potentially drug resistant, and it's really concentrated from having so many animals living in this small concentrated space. When that runoff gets into the farms that actually are growing fruits and vegetables, that E. coli gets on the food, and next thing you know, you have all these food recalls and whatnot. So it is like those recalls, especially, they seem to be becoming more frequent and frequent. It is just a good example of how what we're doing when it comes to food is not sustainable. It's just not. And we're trying to come up with chemicals and strategies to make it more sustainable, but it's almost like we are trying to figure out how to sustain a failing practice without recognizing that it's just a failing practice. And I mean, I get it, the companies who are doing this, they're making billions of dollars off of it, and I feel like they want to keep the money coming while the money's flowing. But it's the same issue that's going on with using gas as opposed to electric energy and sunlight. It's just like we're trying to sustain something everybody knows is not sustainable, but people are just trying to make a whole bunch of money off of it while they can.
Well, I won't even say we. There's some families that want a handful of families that want to keep the cash flowing in.
Right.
At the expense of
at the expense of everybody.
Yeah.
And it's not just Black people.
Correct.
Like I feel like
we're going to make problem. It's been an American problem.
It's a global problem, and it's really created by a handful of people. And I feel like the world is not going to change until we all recognize that, like, wait a minute, we are getting played by a handful of people. So meanwhile, we're having this debate about Black Lives Mattering and all lives mattering. The same people who are having that debate, we're all being played by the same handful of people, and they're just laughing at us while they're breaking in billions and trillions of dollars, and also damaging the planet in which we live and the future for our children. They have enough money where they don't care. Like, if they're like, well, everybody has to live underground bunkers. I got $1 billion in the bank. I can make a bunker, period. But for folks who, you may be well off, you may be a physician, like you may be someone like me. I make a comfortable living. I'm not rich. But if someone's like, Ed, you got to build $1 billion bunker, I'm going to be in the same boat as, somebody flipping burgers at McDonald's. Like, I don't have that type of money. Not even close.
Before we close out, I'm curious, I don't think I read it, but did you hear anything about what dietary path Chadwick Boseman was on for the last few years? I had heard something about he may have been vegetarian. What's your understanding of what his eating path was?
Yeah, I heard somewhere that he did switch over to a plant-based diet. And, when he switched or how long he was on a plant-based diet or what the exact details of his plant-based diet were, I don't know the exact details, but, what I do know, and even for a lot of my patients who actively have cancer, I tell people, if you're, it's one thing if you are taking chemotherapy and everything, I get it, and undergoing surgery, but the food still plays a role. So even if you're trying to actively combat cancer, the phytonutrients that you get from healthy foods, especially a variety of fruits and vegetables, they may contain antioxidants, other nutrients that may actually help in that process of combating cancer itself. So I don't know if he transitioned to a plant-based diet after he was diagnosed, or this is something that happened beforehand. But nonetheless, there's a lot of health benefits for the plant-based diet in people who have cancer, and obviously in people who don't have cancer, and trying to figure out ways to decrease their risk or avoid getting cancer. Another issue that we need to talk about cigarettes. So it is one thing to be on this plant-based diet, and it's one thing to be active. But if you're smoking cigarettes all the time and smoking cigars and doing all this other stuff to look cool, like that practice can definitely limit the benefits of your diet and limit the benefits of your physical activity. So I'm not saying people are smoking, they shouldn't do all that. Like, you need to do that, but you also need to stop smoking. And with African Americans, I mean, like 95% of us who smoke are smoking menthol cigarettes. And like the menthol cigarettes, like, again, if you want to talk about conspiracy theories, it almost sounds like a conspiracy theory when you actually get into the research of what's going on. Like, talking about the truth sounds like a conspiracy. So there was a good research study that didn't really get a whole lot of press, but it's out there. You can look it up. African Americans, we have a genetic variation, or if you want to use the technical scientific term, genetic polymorphism, that makes menthol cigarettes more addictive to us specifically. So 95% of cigarettes we smoke, and 95% of the cigarettes that are marketed to us, all the Cools and Virginia Slims and whatnot, like all that stuff, we have a genetic predisposition for those cigarettes to be more addictive. And what's interesting, so in the Trump administration, they passed some legislation that made e-cigarettes, flavored e-cigarettes, illegal, or they did some legislation around the flavored cigarettes, but they outlawed all the different flavors with the exception of menthol flavors. With the exception of menthol, which is primarily consumed and smoked by African Americans. And there was an interesting study that showed that the menthol cigarettes may actually carry more cancer-causing potential than non-menthol cigarettes. And the reason for that is that the menthol cigarettes are easier to smoke. So the mint, or the mentholation, or the menthol, it gives the smoking kind of a cooling effect. So people can smoke more without actually coughing and without experiencing some of the irritation that comes from smoking itself. So you may be exposed to more carcinogens when you're smoking menthol or mentholated cigarettes, primarily because it's just easier to smoke them. So that's the context in which the standard American diet exists, on top of racism, on top of not exercising as much as we should.
Alcohol plays a role.
Alcohol can play a role. So alcohol, the story of alcohol is interesting. We know obviously too much alcohol is bad. So drinking all the time and doing a 6-pack of beer every day, or when the game comes on, that's too much alcohol.
Doesn't alcohol reduce healthy gut flora?
It can.
I'm speaking of like maybe vodka or gin.
Yeah. So that may have a obviously negative impact on the liver, and it could have an impact on the gut flora, depending on how we process and absorb some of the alcohol. But with alcohol in general, one of the reasons why I say it's complicated, there are some studies that have demonstrated that mild to moderate alcohol use may be associated with longevity. Specifically, if we're doing things, I'm not talking about, sugary alcoholic drinks. I'm really just talking about red wine for the most part.
Because of what, the resveratrol?
Right. So, I mean, at the end of the day, red wine,
grape juice.
Exactly. Red wine is it's a plant-based drink.
Yeah.
And there's phytonutrients in it. So doing a little bit of it every now and again may actually have some real health benefits. So, and even when you look at the blue zones, so the areas of the planet where people have the highest likelihood of living to the age of 100, these are not necessarily alcohol-free areas. They're not places where everybody's drinking alcohol nonstop.
Right.
But there is some alcohol consumption within reason.
Yeah.
So for the most part, I tell people, I do endorse drinking a little bit of red wine, but drinking 6 packs of beers all the time, and I mean when I think about like a lot of the men who were around when I was younger, a lot of my father and some of his friends, and watching what they were doing, I mean they would get a 12, like the Bulls. So I grew up in Chicago, so if the Bulls were on, you would just see guys drinking whole 12 packs in the basement. We're watching Michael Jordan slam dunking everybody, but I see brothers slam dunking beer cans. Like that is not the lifestyle that is healthy. And unfortunately, a lot of those brothers are not here today.
Does alcohol reduce healthy gut flora? If someone is drinking more than twice or 3 times a week, 4 times alcoholic beverage, does that impact or reduce gut flora? Does it not make the stomach environment more acidic?
It can have an impact on healthy gut flora, but I would have to really look at some studies to see if they looked at that in isolation. I mean, oftentimes people who are drinking a whole lot, they're also just living an unhealthy lifestyle in general.
American diet, yeah, sure. Cumulative.
Right. So, yes, I would not be surprised if most alcoholics have unhealthy gut flora, and a lot of that has to do with a combination of different things. One, people who are, real deal, super hardcore alcoholics, they're not even really eating food. And a lot of people are really malnourished because alcohol is their primary source of calorie consumption. And in and of itself, that is a low fiber diet because alcohol does not have fiber. So if most of people's calories are coming from alcohol, they're not going to be feeding their gut bacteria. So even aside from the direct toxic effect that alcohol can have on the gut bacteria, overall it's just a low fiber diet in your average alcoholic, so the bacteria is not going to be fed hand in hand. I mean, it's just not going to be fed. So ultimately, for people who want to do alcohol, like a glass of red wine gets my stamp of approval, but doing cognac and Hennessy all the time is probably not going to be the thing that's going to get you healthy. Okay.
With a cigar, right? With a cigar, right?
Like all the time. Now, people can. We also have to figure out, like everyone has different levels of readiness for change, and you got some folks ready to make the big change, other people ready to make small changes. So when I see people in clinic, I mean, of course, I prefer people to make the big change, but I have to make recommendations and also really assess what people are ready, willing, and capable of doing, and figuring out how to kind of nudge people on that spectrum. So it is a process, but
Totally
I
get it.
appreciate you for what you're doing. I think having this conversation, I agree with you wholeheartedly. Like when we are seeing our heroes dying at early ages from conditions that may or may not that can be preventable to some degree, especially if identified early. It's really that time where we need to have a serious conversation. And I agree with you with the whole Black Lives Matter. I mean, I've been pulled over by police more times than I would like to remember. I've stared down. I grew up in Chicago, but I've never been shot at by like folks in Chicago. But I've had multiple guns by police officers pointed at me, and even been in situations where I'm lucky to be here. So I get the emphasis on police brutality and and over policing in general. However, when I think about Black lives, especially as a physician, and I mean, I've seen people die from colon cancer, heart attack, strokes, diabetes, lymphoma, multiple myeloma. I mean, any condition that you can think of, like I've seen it. So my definition of Black Lives Mattering is is way beyond just our interaction with the police. Because, like you said earlier, we want to say that Black Lives Matter, but we also have to act and behave like our life matters. And, that comes down to lifestyle, and it comes down to, and that lifestyle, it's not just lifestyle. It's also, focusing on our spirit and our mental health. So I feel like, it's one thing to say Black Lives Matter if we're all running around depressed and sad and anxious and not really even, figuring out ways to talk about it and actually work through some of our issues. So Black mental health matters, Black spiritual health matters, Black lives definitely matters. So I think, now's the time where we not only need to focus on, disproportionate issues when it comes to police, but we really have to broaden the conversation to include health.
I agree. Dr. McDonald, this is, we covered quite a bit. I'm appreciative of your time, your expertise, your insight, your passion, your care. I think a lot of the health transformations that I envision African Americans will begin to experience through their own participation. I have what's called the plant-based pledge. And it's basically a vision that I received from God directly back in 2018. I've been doing this work for 22 years, and I've always worked with everybody, not just African Americans, Caucasians, Indian people, as far as personal training, nutrition, performance coaching. But I've always felt, well, I'm born Black for a reason. There's a destiny piece to my race and ethnicity. So I received revelation back in 2018 to play a role in helping African Americans adopt a plant-based eating style nationwide so that we can begin to create a new public health story, because we have the opportunity. We've got to participate in our own health story. We're the ones that are going to turn it around. The government's not going to do it. There's too many special interests, big food, big pharma, big medicine. So it's going to require for African Americans to have more care and compassion for ourselves and to eat like we matter. That whole compassion message in the vegan community, that compassion and care is around our own mortality. It's like, there's a focus on homicide, and it's twofold. There's law enforcement, and then it's African American men in a certain culture, carrying out homicide against other brothers and sisters as well. So, but a lot more of us are dying from our eating choices. And people like Dr. Sebi, salute to Dr. Sebi, Dick Gregory, Dr. Lila Africa, so many, I call them wellness Black Panthers. Paved the way for us to even have this discussion and have the level of care and concern that we have. So I appreciate the work you do. You're a physician who's plant-based and a chef. We need to do a part 2, man, so we can,
we should do part 2.
The culinary spin on it, because food is, we're talking health success. And we didn't really talk about metabolic health. But we can have a talk about metabolic health, meals, and then you can come from a culinary standpoint. Look, we got to go plant-based. This is how you put that African American pizzazz and flavor into it.
And that's what I do, man. So I do a lot of cooking demonstrations in the hospital, and I love it when I got older brothers coming in to the cooking demonstration, and they'll take a picture of a recipe they learned. They're like, "Oh, Dr. McDonald, I was out there, I went to the store and got some Ezekiel bread and got some avocados, and I made some avocado toast with some sun-dried tomatoes, and I chopped up some collard greens and throw it on there." And they showed me a picture. I'm like, man, like that's the type of stuff that means, so much more to me than, some publication, some scientific journal or something like that. Like all that stuff. That's, like that.
One meal at a time.
Right.
1 meal at a time.
1 meal at a time. And it's just like when I see an older brother getting excited about cooking healthy food, and this is an older brother that, just like my father and uncles and their friends and whatnot, was in the basement watching the Bulls, drinking a 6-pack. Now he's riding his bike around the south side of Chicago and talking about making avocado toast, like, and saying it in a way where he's proud. And he's not relying on these old school gender stereotypes. It's just like, oh man, it's avocado toast. It's delicious. I mean, the same way, like seeing people have that same conversation, the same way people talk about their barbecue. So, back in the day, you go to a cookout, you got brother, on the grill making some ribs or something like that. Talk a whole lot of trash. Oh man, like those ribs are fire. Like you never had ribs that good. But when I see people, making some black bean soup, like, yo, man, you got to try the black bean soup. Like, it's fire. I threw some mangoes in there. Like, what do you know about the black bean soup with the mangoes? And
I would have never thought about the two being combined. That's creative.
Yeah. So, like, I love when I see black men changing the narrative. And I love it when it's older brothers because a lot of people have this misconception that, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. That's BS. That's totally BS. People can change at any point in their life. You just have to have the willingness to actually make the change. And that comes from within. You have people who can be the motivators. But even with the best motivator, you have to decide to make the change yourself.
That's right. You have to care. You have to care enough to want to be here long term. And I always tell people, I have a son, and I think I overheard you say in our first phone call, you are a father just like me. I'm 49, and Dr. McDonald, I'm not sure what your age is, but I always tell people I can't afford to die early because I got an 8-year-old son. And I have a daughter that's 24, Naila. And I want to be here to tell stories at 100 years of age or older. I want to be at least, I tell people all the time, and this blows, when I talk to a lot of black men, it blows their mind because a lot of them don't expect to live long. And then when they connect with me, whether they're a client, they hear me talking longevity.
Yeah.
Most of the times in our circles, there's more talk about life insurance, which is, I believe, important financially. But in other words, there's no expectation to even live long. That's what's not being said. So a part of this the work we do, we're going to bring longevity into the conversation.
Yeah, I think longevity is the goal. I mean, I know
great grandfathers.
Yeah, like I see people who want to lose weight and whatnot. Like the weight is a number on the scale. But if you're leading a lifestyle associated with longevity, that, the weight's going to come off. It's definitely going to come off. And I feel like sometimes we get focused on the superficial when we need to be focused on, the deeper meaning of living a healthy lifestyle. And I think that deeper meaning really lies in living longer and healthier. So, I just buried my last grandparent a couple of weeks ago. So my grandfather, he died at 96 years old. But I feel blessed. And my other grandparents, everyone lived to at least 88. So I've had 2 grandparents in their 90s and, 2 other grandparents that lived, well into their late 80s. And, right now, my grandfather's sister still alive, my Aunt Natalie. She's 99 years old and almost 100. But she's 99 with it. I mean, she's still driving. We got to tell her not to drive. But she's in Detroit, and you can't tell her anything. She's just like, I'm in Detroit. I'm in here 99 years. I'm going to do what I want to do. It's like, okay, well, whatever. But, when I see my grandfather and I see her specifically, there's so much history and so much stories that they have imparted to me that I want to be in the same position to have those conversations with, my children, my great-grandchildren, grandchildren, etc. When I think about my grandfather, like, I remember we were watching Saving Private Ryan together when it came out. And this is a brother that was in World War II. So like watching a movie about World War II from a brother who was actually there and having a conversation while the movie was going on, I mean, that is just amazing. And you know, he paused the movie. It's like, man, shit didn't go down like that. Like it wasn't like that. You know, I was, you know, in Normandy, and this is how it was.
Mm.
And that is something that I would appreciate, and I definitely want to be in a position to have similar conversations with, you know, my subsequent descendants. You know, I want to be able to say, look, man, I was around when we had this pandemic. Like
Mm.
I was in the hospital. Like I saw what was going on. I showed up to work. I
Mm.
had my mask on every day. I saw, you know, many of my brothers and sisters pass away,
Yep.
but you know, we figured out how to overcome it. Um, and I want them to look at me with the same awe that I looked at my grandfather when he was talking about the stuff that I only read in the history books.
Mm.
But in order for me to get there, I have to take care of this body to get there. And one of the best ways to do that is really to focus on the foods that I'm consuming, and also physical activity. And speaking of physical activity, my family's waiting for me. We do family exercise night.
That's a blessing, man. I appreciate your time. We'll have to do a part 2 or a summit. I'm
Okay.
going to be in touch with you, Dr. McDonald. I really appreciate you, brother. Thank you so much for what you've given, what you've contributed. And man, we will continue this work, man. You know,
Okay.
our destinies have been, our paths have crossed, and our
Yeah.
destinies are intertwined. And, you know, I truly believe that you and I and many others will, over the next decade plus, contribute to creating a new African American public health story.
Yeah, I say let's do it, man. And you know, if you ever in Chicago, you got a friend in Chicago, all right?
Love it, brother. Thank you
All
so
right,
much.
man. Let's
Thank
do it
you.
again. So just let me know. Just send me a text message or something. We'll make it happen.
Done. Thank you so much.
All right, man.
Dr. McDonald, have a wonderful night.
You too.
Thank you so much. Okay, folks, I'm going to wrap it up. I know it's been very informative, very insightful, a lot of perspectives, just a profound conversation. I'm knowing you enjoyed it. I'm going to say good night. Thank you for participating and watching. I'm going to look at your comments. It may not be tonight, but I'll start responding by tomorrow for sure. Have a lovely evening. And by all means, share this with those you care about. And remember to eat like you matter. It's time to go plant based. Go to www.plantbaseddaypledge.com. Become a member of our growing community so that you can personally take the pledge, adopt a plant based eating style, and create a new health story in your family. Take care. God bless. Have a wonderful evening.